My parents forced me into a purity cult that starved me to 89 pounds. When I finally escaped at 19, my mom said I'd betrayed God. 5 years later, she called begging me to save my sister who was dying from the same program. I was 14 when my parents discovered the Sanctuary of Sacred Daughters online and decided my rebellious attitude needed divine intervention. Mom had caught me texting a boy from school, and apparently that meant I was destined for eternal damnation, unless they took drastic action. The compound sat on 40 acres in rural Montana, surrounded by barbed wire fences that the leaders claimed were to keep the corrupt world out, not to keep us in. Pastor Matthias Crow greeted new families with this warm smile and gentle handshake that made parents think they'd found salvation for their wayward daughters. He had piercing blue eyes and spoke in this soft, hypnotic voice about purifying young women's souls through sacrifice and submission. The first week felt like an expensive summer camp with daily Bible study, group prayers, and communal meals in the main dining hall. We wore modest white dresses that covered us from neck to ankle, and our days started at 5 a.m., with silent meditation followed by 2 hours of scripture memorization. The other girls seemed peaceful and content, their faces glowing with what I assumed was spiritual fulfillment. Looking back, I realized that glow was actually malnutrition combined with the euphoria that comes from severe calorie restriction. My roommate Sarah had been there for 2 years and weighed maybe 90 pounds despite being 5'6". When I asked why she was so thin, she smiled serenely and said fasting brought her closer to God's love. By the second month, the true nature of the program became clear. Pastor Crow explained that worldly desires, including the desire for food, were Satan's way of corrupting pure souls. Our meals were reduced to single slices of bread and water for breakfast, a small bowl of vegetable broth for lunch, and nothing for dinner except herbal tea that tasted like dirt mixed with chemicals. When girls complained about hunger, Crow would gather everyone in the chapel and make the complainer stand before the group while he lectured about gluttony being a sin that needed to be starved out of our bodies. The other girls would nod along, their hollow eyes reflecting the candlelight as they whispered amens and praised the girl for her suffering. Physical exercise became a form of punishment disguised as spiritual discipline. Girls who showed signs of rebellion had to run laps around the compound for hours while carrying heavy stones and reciting verses about obedience. I was forced to do this frequently because I kept asking when I could call my parents or when visiting day would be. Crow would stand on the porch watching with his arms folded, occasionally shouting corrections about my running form or demanding I speak louder when reciting scripture. The combination of extreme exercise and severe calorie restriction made girls pass out regularly, but Crow insisted these episodes were holy visions sent by God to reward our dedication. The weight loss happened frighteningly fast. Within 4 months, I'd dropped from 135 pounds to 105, and my period stopped completely. When I mentioned this to one of the female supervisors, Sister Rebecca, she smiled and congratulated me on achieving purity, explaining that monthly bleeding was Eve's curse, and losing it meant God was cleansing my sinful female nature. My hair started falling out in clumps during the required daily cold showers, and my teeth became loose in my gums from nutritional deficiencies. But whenever I looked in the cracked mirror above the shared bathroom sinks, other girls would tell me I looked radiant and blessed, that my suffering was beautiful in God's eyes. Letters from home were heavily censored, with entire paragraphs blacked out by Sister Rebecca before we received them. When I tried to write to my parents about the conditions, I had to submit my letters for approval first, and anything mentioning hunger, illness, or wanting to leave was marked as demonic influence that needed to be removed. The approved version that went to my parents contained only praise for the program and requests for them to send more money for my continued spiritual development. I learned later that Pastor Crow was charging my parents $5,000 per month for this treatment, plus additional fees for special purification ceremonies and private counseling sessions. The ceremonies were the worst part. Every few weeks, Crow would select girls who needed extra purification and subject them to hours-long rituals in the basement of the main building. We had to strip down to thin white gowns and lie on stone altars while he chanted and sprinkled us with ice-cold water mixed with salt and herbs. The basement was freezing, and lying nearly naked on stone while severely underweight made the cold feel like knives cutting through my skin. Crow would place his hands on our bodies, claiming he was drawing out demonic influences, while we shivered uncontrollably and tried not to cry because showing weakness meant you needed additional purification sessions. By my 16th birthday, I weighed 94 pounds and was so weak I could barely stand for the required daily prayer sessions. My vision was blurry from malnutrition, and I'd developed this persistent cough that rattled in my chest because my immune system had basically shut down. When I collapsed during morning meditation, hitting my head hard enough to bleed, Crow gathered the other girls and explained that Satan was fighting extra hard to reclaim my soul because I was so close to achieving perfect purity. The girls formed a circle around me while I lay bleeding on the floor and prayed for my demons to be cast out instead of helping me get medical attention. That's when I started planning my escape. I began saving tiny portions of bread from breakfast, hiding crumbs in my pillowcase to eat later when the hunger became unbearable. During mandatory outdoor work sessions, I started paying attention to the fence line, looking for weak spots or places where the barbed wire might be loose. I noticed that the main gate was left unlocked during the early morning hours when the night watchman fell asleep in his chair around 4 a.m. The plan was simple but terrifying. Sneak out during the night shift change, run the 12 miles to the nearest town, and hope I could find help before they caught me. The night I finally escaped was a Wednesday in October when the temperature had already dropped below freezing. I waited until I heard Sister Rebecca's footsteps fade down the hallway after her final bed check, then carefully removed the loose floorboard under my bed where I'd hidden the breadcrumbs and an extra pair of socks. My hands were shaking so badly from cold and adrenaline that I could barely tie my shoes, and I had to bite down on my pillowcase to muffle the sound of my chattering teeth. The hallway creaked with every step, and each sound made me freeze in terror that someone would discover me missing and drag me back to face Pastor Crow's punishment. Getting past the night watchman was easier than expected because he was snoring loudly in his chair with an empty whiskey bottle at his feet. The main gate squeaked when I opened it, but not loud enough to wake him. And suddenly I was outside the compound for the first time in 2 years. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, unmarked and surrounded by dense forest that looked black against the starry sky. I chose what I hoped was the direction toward town and started walking as fast as my weakened legs could carry me, glancing back constantly to see if anyone was following with flashlights or vehicles. The 12-mile walk took me almost 5 hours because I had to stop frequently to rest and warm my hands inside my sleeves. By the time I reached the outskirts of Millerville, the sun was coming up and I was hypothermic, barely able to form coherent words when I stumbled into the first open business, a truck stop diner called Rosie's Cafe. The waitress, an older woman named Dolores, took one look at my skeletal appearance and immediately called both the police and an ambulance while wrapping me in heated blankets and trying to get me to sip warm broth that my stomach couldn't handle anymore. Officer Janet Kowalski was the first responder, and she sat with me in the ambulance while paramedics started an IV because I was too dehydrated for them to find veins easily. I tried to explain about the compound, about Pastor Crow and the girls who were still trapped there, but my speech was slurred from exhaustion and malnutrition. Officer Kowalski assured me I was safe now, and that they would investigate everything I told them, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes, like maybe I was just another runaway making up stories to avoid going home to my parents. The hospital in Millerville was small, but Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who treated me, had experience with eating disorder patients and immediately recognized signs of severe malnutrition and psychological trauma. She admitted me to the ICU for emergency treatment and called in a social worker named Kevin Thompson to interview me about my situation. This time, when I described the compound and what had been happening there, Kevin listened carefully and took detailed notes. He explained that there had been rumors about the Sanctuary of Sacred Daughters for years, but no concrete evidence of abuse because families voluntarily sent their children there and paid substantial fees. My parents arrived at the hospital the next day, and their reaction was not what I expected or hoped for. Instead of relief that I was alive, Mom's first words were, "How could you do this to us?" She explained that Pastor Crow had called them immediately when they discovered I was missing, and he'd told them I'd been influenced by demons and abandoned my path to salvation. She was crying as she spoke, not from concern about my health, but from shame that I'd embarrassed the family by running away from such an expensive treatment program. Dad stood silently beside her hospital bed, his jaw clenched in anger, occasionally shaking his head in disappointment. When Dr. Rodriguez explained that I was suffering from severe malnutrition and showed them my medical charts documenting my weight loss and physical condition, Mom insisted it was just normal teenage weight fluctuation and that I'd always been dramatic about medical issues. "She's always been a difficult child," she told the doctor, as if that explained away my 89-pound weight and the fact that my hair was falling out in chunks. Dad finally spoke up to say they'd invested over $60,000 in my spiritual development at the compound, and my escape had wasted their money and destroyed my chance for redemption. The social worker Kevin tried to explain to my parents that what I'd described sounded like systematic abuse and starvation, but they remained convinced that Pastor Crow was a holy man, helping troubled youth find God's path. The program was working, Mom insisted. She was finally learning discipline and humility. Now she'll probably go back to her rebellious ways and end up pregnant or on drugs. When Kevin suggested they consider pressing charges against the compound, Dad laughed bitterly and said I was probably making up stories because I didn't want to face the consequences of my bad behavior. Kevin arranged for me to stay in a foster home while Child Protective Services investigated my claims about the compound. The foster parents, Ruth and Michael Bennett, were experienced with trauma cases and gave me space to heal without pressure to talk about my experiences. Ruth was a retired nurse who understood eating disorder recovery and helped me gradually increase my food intake without triggering the panic attacks that came with eating normal portions. She never made me feel guilty about the months it took to gain back weight or the nightmares that woke me up screaming about ice-cold basement ceremonies and Pastor Crow's hands on my body. Meanwhile, Officer Kowalski had convinced her department to investigate the compound based on my testimony and the clear evidence of my physical condition. They sent an undercover officer posing as a parent interested in enrolling his daughter, and he returned with disturbing reports about the isolated location, the severely underweight girls he observed, and Pastor Crow's bizarre lectures about purifying young women through suffering. The investigation took months because the compound was located across county lines and involved complex jurisdictional issues, but eventually they obtained warrants to search the property and interview the girls who were still trapped there. The raid on the Sanctuary of Sacred Daughters happened on a Thursday morning in March, 6 months after my escape. Officer Kowalski called to let me know they'd found 18 girls ranging in age from 13 to 19, all suffering from varying degrees of malnutrition and psychological trauma. My former roommate Sarah had to be hospitalized immediately because she'd dropped to 78 pounds and was in organ failure from prolonged starvation. 3 other girls were in critical condition, and all of them required extensive medical treatment and counseling to begin recovering from what medical experts testified was systematic torture disguised as religious discipline. Pastor Crow was arrested on multiple charges, including child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, practicing medicine without a license, and fraud for collecting payment while endangering children's health. The compound was shut down immediately, and federal investigators discovered that Crow had been operating similar facilities in 4 other states under different names, systematically moving whenever local authorities started asking questions. During his arrest, officers found detailed files on every girl who'd been in the program, including photos documenting their weight loss and medical decline that Crow had apparently kept as trophies of his success in breaking down their physical and psychological resistance. My parents' reaction to the raid and arrests was to blame me for destroying a program that had been helping troubled youth find salvation. They hired a lawyer to try to sue me for defamation, claiming I'd made up stories that resulted in the wrongful imprisonment of a holy man. When that failed, they started attending a different church, where the pastor preached about the persecution of righteous Christians by secular authorities, and they became even more convinced that I'd been corrupted by worldly influences and had betrayed God by exposing the compound's work. The trial took place almost a year after the raid, and I was the primary witness for the prosecution, testifying about the starvation, the cold basement ceremonies, and Pastor Crow's inappropriate touching was traumatic, but I felt like I owed it to the other girls to make sure their abuser faced consequences. Crow's defense attorney tried to paint me as a troubled teenager with a history of rebellion who had convinced other impressionable girls to make false accusations, but the medical evidence spoke for itself. 18 girls with severe malnutrition, documented weight loss, and consistent stories about systematic abuse couldn't be explained away as teenage rebellion. During my testimony, I had to describe the daily food restrictions, the punishment exercises, and the pseudo-medical procedures Crow performed while claiming to remove demons from our bodies. The courtroom was silent as I explained how he'd convinced parents to pay thousands of dollars monthly while he systematically starved their daughters and subjected them to psychological manipulation. When the prosecution showed photos of me taken during my hospitalization, weighing 89 pounds with visible ribs and sunken cheeks, several jury members looked visibly upset, and one woman actually started crying. Pastor Crow was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. The judge specifically noted during sentencing that Crow had exploited parents' religious beliefs to gain access to vulnerable children, then systematically abused his position of trust to cause severe physical and psychological harm. 3 other staff members, including Sister Rebecca, received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years for their roles in the abuse, and the compound property was sold to pay restitution to victims and their families. My parents attended every day of the trial, but not to support me. They sat in the back row with other families who still believed Pastor Crow was innocent, whispering among themselves during breaks about how sad it was that their children had been brainwashed by secular authorities into betraying their faith. When the guilty verdict was announced, Mom audibly sobbed and Dad had to be escorted out by bailiffs after he stood up and shouted that justice had been perverted by Satan's influence in the courtroom. After the trial, I didn't hear from my parents for almost 3 years. I finished high school through independent study while continuing therapy and working part-time jobs to support myself. Ruth and Michael Bennett had allowed me to stay with them even after turning 18, treating me like the daughter they'd never had, and helping me apply for college scholarships available to survivors of religious trauma. I enrolled in a social work program at the State University, inspired by Kevin Thompson's kindness during my recovery, and determined to help other kids escape similar situations. College was challenging because I still struggled with panic attacks during stressful periods, and I had to be careful not to fall back into restrictive eating patterns during finals weeks or when dealing with difficult assignments. The campus counseling center connected me with other survivors of religious abuse, and we formed an informal support group that met weekly to discuss our experiences and coping strategies. It was healing to realize I wasn't alone in having parents who'd chosen their religious beliefs over their children's safety and well-being. I was 24 and finishing my master's degree in social work when my phone rang at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. The caller ID showed my mother's number, which I'd kept blocked for years, but apparently hadn't updated when I changed phone carriers. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up on the final ring before it went to voicemail. Mom's voice was hysterical, barely coherent through her sobbing, and it took me several minutes to understand what she was trying to say through her tears and desperate pleas for help. "It's Lily," she finally managed to choke out between sobs. "She's dying, and I don't know what to do. They said she's too far gone, that we waited too long to get help. Please, I know you hate us, but she's your sister, and she needs you now. I should have believed you before. I should have listened. I'm so sorry, but please help us save her." The desperation in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from my composed, religiously righteous mother who had always been so certain about her moral superiority and God's plan. My younger sister Lily had been only 10 when I escaped from the compound, and I'd assumed she was too young for my parents to subject her to the same treatment. But as Mom explained through her tears, they'd enrolled Lily in a similar program called Daughters of Divine Grace when she turned 16 and started showing what they considered rebellious behavior like listening to secular music and wearing makeup. This new facility operated out of Arizona and claimed to help families restore their daughters' purity through prayer, fasting, and spiritual discipline that sounded exactly like the horrors I'd experienced at Pastor Crow's compound. Lily had been in the program for 8 months and had dropped from 130 pounds to 79 pounds when she collapsed during a group prayer session and was rushed to the hospital with multiple organ failure. The doctors at Phoenix General told my parents that her kidneys were shutting down from severe dehydration and malnutrition, her heart rhythm was dangerously irregular, and she needed immediate intensive medical intervention to have any chance of survival. The program directors had initially refused to allow her to be hospitalized, insisting that her collapse was a spiritual test that required more prayer and fasting, not worldly medical intervention. The doctors said she might not make it through the night. Mom sobbed into the phone. They want to know about her medical history, about whether she's been in similar programs before, and I told them about what happened to you. One of the doctors recognized the compound name from news reports about Pastor Crow's trial, and he said we need to contact someone who survived a similar experience to help them understand what they're dealing with. I know you never want to see us again, but please. She's just 17, and she doesn't deserve to die because of our mistakes. The flight to Phoenix was the longest 4 hours of my life. I sat in the cramped airplane seat trying to process the fact that my parents had learned nothing from what happened to me, that they'd subjected my sister to the same systematic abuse that had nearly killed me. Part of me wanted to hang up on Mom and let them face the consequences of their choices, but Lily was innocent in all of this, just a kid who'd been failed by the adults who were supposed to protect her. I called ahead to Phoenix General and spoke with Dr. Lisa Martinez, who was treating Lily in the ICU, to explain my background and offer to help them understand the specific medical complications that result from the type of religious abuse Lily had endured. When I walked into Lily's hospital room, I barely recognized the skeletal figure lying unconscious among the tubes and monitors. She looked exactly like I had when I'd escaped from the compound, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, her hair thin and brittle from malnutrition. Mom and Dad were sitting beside her bed holding hands and praying, but they looked up when I entered, and the expression on Mom's face was pure shame, mixed with desperate hope. She started to apologize again, but I cut her off and focused on Dr. Martinez, who needed specific information about the timeline and methods of abuse to properly treat Lily's condition. Based on what you've told me about your own experience, Dr. Martinez explained as we stood outside Lily's room, we're dealing with systematic starvation, complicated by forced exercise, probable dehydration from restricted fluid intake, and possible exposure to unknown herbal supplements or chemicals. Her electrolyte levels are dangerously imbalanced, and we're seeing signs of muscle breakdown that suggest the abuse has been ongoing for months. The good news is that she's young and we caught it before complete organ failure, but recovery will take months and she'll need extensive psychological support to deal with the trauma. I spent the next week in Phoenix, staying in a hotel near the hospital, and working with Dr. Martinez and the psychiatric team to help them understand Lily's situation. I provided detailed information about the daily routines at religious abuse facilities, the psychological manipulation techniques they use, and the specific medical complications that result from their treatment methods. Most importantly, I helped them prepare for Lily's psychological state when she regained consciousness, explaining how victims of religious abuse often resist medical treatment because they've been conditioned to believe suffering is spiritual and that seeking help is a sign of weakness or demonic influence. When Lily finally woke up after 5 days in the ICU, her first words were to ask if she was in trouble for failing her spiritual test. She was confused and disoriented, asking for Sister Margaret and Pastor Williams, the leaders of her facility, and becoming agitated when nurses tried to explain that she was in a hospital receiving medical treatment. I sat beside her bed and gently explained who I was, reminding her of memories from our childhood before she'd been sent away, helping her understand that she was safe now and that the people who had hurt her could no longer reach her. They told me you were possessed by demons, Lily whispered when she finally recognized me. They said that's why you lied about the compound and destroyed Pastor Crow's holy work. But you don't look possessed. You look healthy and normal, like how I used to look before. She trailed off, staring down at her skeletal arms with growing horror as the fog of malnutrition began to clear from her mind. Did they do this to me? Did they make me sick on purpose? Over the following days, I helped Lily understand what had been done to her, explaining the cycle of abuse that religious facilities use to break down their victims' resistance and create psychological dependence. I shared my own story of recovery, showing her photos of how I'd gradually regained weight and health after escaping, proving that healing was possible even when the damage seemed overwhelming. Most importantly, I helped her understand that our parents' choices were not her fault, that she deserved love and care regardless of whether she met their religious expectations. My parents remained convinced that both facilities had been legitimate religious programs until detectives from the Arizona Attorney General's office arrived to interview Lily about her experiences. The investigation revealed that Daughters of Divine Grace was operated by a former associate of Pastor Crow, who had learned his methods during visits to the Montana compound before it was shut down. The Arizona facility used identical techniques including systematic starvation, forced exercise, cold exposure, and inappropriate physical contact during purification ceremonies, all while charging parents $7,000 per month for the privilege of having their daughters systematically abused. When faced with detailed evidence of what had been done to Lily, including medical records documenting her severe malnutrition and photos of other victims, my parents finally began to understand the magnitude of their mistakes. Dad broke down completely during one of the detective interviews, sobbing as he realized that his desire to control his daughter's behavior had led him to pay strangers to torture them. Mom kept repeating, "I thought we were saving them," while staring at photos of Lily's skeletal condition, finally understanding that her religious convictions had been exploited by predators who used parents' faith as a weapon against their own children. The Arizona facility was raided 2 weeks after Lily's hospitalization, resulting in the rescue of 14 girls in various stages of malnutrition and psychological breakdown. 3 girls required immediate intensive care, and all of them needed months of medical treatment and psychological support to begin recovering from their trauma. Pastor Williams and Sister Margaret were arrested on charges including child abuse, fraud, and operating an unlicensed medical facility, joining the growing list of religious leaders who had exploited families' faith to gain access to vulnerable children. Lily's physical recovery took 6 months of careful medical supervision and nutritional rehabilitation. Her psychological recovery is ongoing, but she's made remarkable progress with the help of specialized therapists who understand religious trauma and eating disorder recovery. She's living with Ruth and Michael Bennett now, the same foster parents who helped me heal, and she's planning to start college next fall with a major in psychology so she can eventually help other survivors of religious abuse. My relationship with my parents has been slowly rebuilding over the past 2 years, but it's complicated and will probably always be fragile. They've joined a support group for families affected by religious abuse and are working with therapists to understand how their beliefs were manipulated by predators. They testified against both Pastor Crow's associates and the Arizona facility operators, helping secure convictions that will keep these abusers away from children for decades. Most importantly, they've accepted responsibility for their choices and are working to make amends, though they understand that forgiveness is a process that may take years. Today, I work as a specialized social worker helping other survivors of religious abuse navigate their recovery and legal options. Lily and I co-facilitate support groups for young adults who've escaped similar situations, and we've testified before state legislatures advocating for stronger oversight of religious facilities that claim to treat troubled youth. Our parents' willingness to admit their mistakes and support our advocacy work has been an important part of their redemption, though the scars from their choices will affect our family forever.